today, we have the pleasure to have a talk by Gerhard Seel. He was one of the keynote speakers at the fourth World Congress on Logic and Religion that took place in Sinai in 2023. I will put the link here for the people who were not there. In Sinai, which is a nice small village in Romania, which is quite nice. So we had a nice
beautiful,
meeting,
yeah.
and then beautiful. And then after the meeting, we are publishing some of the papers. I will put the link here. We have published a special issue of Logica Universalis, which is gathering together papers from the Congress in the Congress in India and the one in Sinai, because they were organized one after the other because of the pandemic. The Congress in India was delayed, and then we decided to organize. So the Congress in India was in 2022, and then the Congress in Sinai in 23. So we are publishing now some special issue of journals and books with the paper of the two meetings. And I take also the opportunity to say that we are working now on the fifth edition of the World Congress on Logic and Religion, with projected to take place in Vancouver, in Canada, next year in 2026, probably in July. We'll give you more information soon about that. So today we have a presentation by Gerhard Seel, who was during many years professor of philosophy at the University of Bern in Switzerland, and with part of the board of the direction board of the FISP, which is a Federal International Federation of Philosophical Society in the world. So the last meeting took place of the FISP took place in Roma last year, and the next one will be in Japan. I don't know, I don't remember exactly which year, but probably 2028.
Yes.
Okay, so the talk today is related with the proof of the existence of God by Kant. Of course, the topic of proofs of existence of God is something which is typical of our project because there's connection between logic and religion. So there were in the history of theology and philosophy and logic, there are many different kind of proofs. The first famous one is by Saint Anselm, which is called the ontological proof. And then the more recent one, the most recent one is due to the famous logician Gerhard. But meanwhile, there were some different proofs, and one by Kant, which is not so well known, if I may say, but which is quite interesting because Kant is criticizing the ontological proof, saying that existence cannot be considered as a predicate. And then he presents another proof, which has not really been studied a lot, if I may say. And so today, Gerhard will make a critical presentation of the Kant proof from 1763. Please.
Thank you very much, Jean-Yves. Can everybody hear me perfectly well, or should I speak louder
Yeah.
or less loud?
Okay.
It's
It's
okay.
okay? Thank you very much. So as Jean-Yves just told us, it's effectively the privileged field where logic and religion come together. These are the so-called proofs of the existence of God. And concerning Kant, he is really famous for having criticized and refuted the most prominent arguments of this kind in his critique of pure reason. That is the so-called ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and the physico-theological argument. Those three arguments criticized by Kant in his Critique of Pure Reason, and that was published, the first edition, in 1781. But it is less well known that Kant himself put forward an argument to demonstrate the existence of God. He developed the gist of his argument already in the Nova Dilucidatio, and this is from 1755. And then he published the more elaborated version of the argument in 1763. And this publication made Kant immediately famous by a positive review of his paper by Moses Mendelssohn. So that is a short historical remark to put it in the context of the history of philosophy. The literature on this topic is very controversial. It is an open question whether Kant's argument is correct, and whether, if it is correct, Kant himself refuted it in his critical work. My limited space doesn't allow me to address all these debates. My purpose is much simpler. I will reconstruct Kant's argument with the means of modern logic and semantics and show which are, in my view, its weak points. To achieve this, I use a combination of the formalism of predicate, propositional, and modal logic, though without introducing such a logic. It's only a tool for presenting in a formal language the different principles we have to discuss. One may object that this procedure is inadequate because my terminology, of course, differs from Kant's terminology. In fact, I speak of a necessary state of affairs, while Kant is speaking of a necessary individual being. However, this difference doesn't mean that we don't speak about the same entities and address the same problems. Kant wants to show that a being that has certain properties is a necessary being, and it is a state of affairs that a being has certain properties. So finally, when I ask whether this state of affairs is necessarily the case, I ask the very same question that Kant is asking. So you in the published paper, you find the symbols of the formal language I'm using, but I will not, of course, have the time to introduce this language here. Just have a look to it if we are discussing the different principles Kant puts forward. Let me first explain the structure and the principles of Kant's argument. Kant proceeds in 3 steps. In the first step, he demonstrates that, I quote, "it is absolutely impossible that nothing exists." Then, in a second step, he tries to show that there is exactly one being that exists in an absolute necessary way. And in a final step, he shows that this necessary being has all the properties we normally attribute to God and hence is God. But to show that his argument is the only possible one, as he pretends, he must also show that all other conceivable arguments are fallacies. He does this explicitly in the last part of his treatise, but I have not the time to address this critical part of his work. Maybe we can go to it in our discussion. It is important to see that what Kant tries to demonstrate in his first step is different from and much weaker than what he tries to show in his second step. He formulates the result of his first proof as follows, I quote, "It is impossible that nothing exists." By conversion, we get, "It is necessary that something exists." In our modern terminology, we would say, "It is necessary that there is at least one state of affairs that is the case." The result of his second step is that, I quote again, "a being exists that is absolutely necessary." We have to read this thesis as there is at least one state of affairs P such that it is necessary that P. The difference between the two formulae is evident. What differs is the place of the modal operator. In the first formula, what is necessary is that at least one state of affairs is the case. This is compatible with all states of affairs are contingent. In the second formula, however, what is necessary is that a certain state of affairs is the case. In other words, that there is a state of affairs P, and it is necessary that P. In paragraph 3, Kant adds an argument that is meant to show that there can be only one necessary being, or that the necessary being is unique. So we must strengthen Kant's thesis again. It is, I quote, "there is exactly one state of affairs that is necessarily the case." Let's now look to the principles Kant uses in his first step to prove this last point. The first principle is the principle of the through-going determination of each thing. Kant holds that each individual thing is determined by the absolute totality of all predicates in such a way that it either has the quality in question or lacks this property. He calls it the principle of through-going determination and explains, I quote, "according to which, among all possible predicates of things, insofar as they are compared with their opposites, one must apply to it." So we can reformulate this principle as follows: of each substance X and of all predicates P, either X is P or X is not P. This principle, which I myself call principle 1, P1, Kant has not given names to his principles, so it's my work. P1 allows to conceive of a being which is determined by the totality of all positive predicates. This being is called ens realissimum and identified with God. Kant modifies, however, this concept in an very important point. He argues that God cannot have all positive properties because some are contradicting each other. For instance, God cannot be a pure spirit and have a body. Therefore, Kant conceives God as a being, as the being that has all properties that contribute to his perfection. And that God is the real cause, that is the creator of the beings that have the rest of the positive properties. Let me now come to the very important ontological argument Jean-Yves already mentioned, an argument put forward by Saint Anselm, by Descartes, and by others, also St. Thomas in his Septemvia has this argument. On the basis of the concept of the ens realissimum, in fact, we can develop an argument to demonstrate the existence of God. If exists is one of the predicates that make God a perfect being, then we cannot think of God without thinking that he exists. His existence follows from his concept. This is the gist of the so-called ontological argument. So the concept of God implies the existence of God. Therefore, God is a necessary being. Now, this argument was criticized by Kant already in his first treatise. We have not to wait till the critique of pure reason. If you look to the treatise of 63, you will see that Kant opens his argument with the affirmation, very strong affirmation, that exists is not a predicate and contributes in no way to God's perfection. He is, in my view, absolutely right about this. In fact, he is in this regard a precursor of Frege and Wittgenstein, who distinguish states of affairs on one hand and facts on the other, and thus admit states of affairs that are through-going determined by all positive predicates, but are not the case. The expression A is M describes a state of affairs and is neither true nor false. To get an expression that is either true or false, we need to add an operator which says that the described state of affairs is the case. Think of Frege's famous statement operator. In my formal language, I use the symbol T for this operator. It is important to see that unlike M, T is not a predicate. Predicates have the function to determine the properties of an individual substance. If we combine the expression for a predicate with the expression for an individual substance, we form the expression of a state of affairs. We don't affirm that this state of affairs is the case. For this, we need to put the "it is the case" operator in front of the expression for the state of affairs. So, from our today's point of view, Kant is right. But if he is right, the ontological argument is refuted. This opens the way for Kant to develop a new argument. And this new argument I will now analyze in my second section. Let me first explain the principles of Kant's first proof. In his second consideration, Kant distinguishes two concepts of possibility: formal and material possibility. According to the first, something is possible if it doesn't involve a contradiction. So the state of affairs, A is M and N, is possible if M and N do not exclude each other. That is, if MA and NA do not stand in the relation of contradiction. According to the second concept of possibility, something is possible if its predicate is real. In this case, and only in this case, M has a meaning. So let me explain what Kant means when he says a predicate is real. He speaks of inner or material possibility, affirming that this kind of possibility presupposes something real or something that exists. According to Kant, the latter condition is fulfilled if the predicate P, for the predicate P, if and only if there is some X that is really P. If this is not the case, Kant says, I quote, nothing is given to be thought, but everything that is possible is something that can be thought. So we would accept, Kant would accept the following principle. It's my P2. It is possible that X is P only if there is a Y such that it is the case that Y is P. In the literature, P2 is called the actualist principle. It is a position which we know from the debate about the status of universals. Actually, it is the position Aristotle defended in this debate, namely that there are no universals that are not instantiated in the real world, in the real empirical world. Plato, on the contrary, knows universals that are never instantiated in the empirical world. In fact, if there were ideas in Plato's sense, they could found the possibility of states of affairs, and Kant's argument would fail. So from P2, we can immediately, by conversion, get to P3. P3 is the following principle. If there is no X and no P, such that it is the case that X is P, there will be no Y in such a way that it is possible that Y is P. Kant emphasizes that it is not contradictory to suppose that nothing exists. However, he contends that the one who holds that nothing exists and nevertheless claims that something is possible contradicts himself. This is Kant's answer to Leibniz's famous question, why is it the case that something exists instead of nothing? Something must exist if something should be possible. Now, it is clear that in order to proceed in the argument, we need a further principle. And this is my principle P4. P4 is the following principle. There is at least one state of affairs, X is P, that is possibly the case. At least one state of affairs is possibly the case. Kant doesn't formulate P4, but P4 occurs in all sound reconstructions of his argument. Some scholars presuppose an even stronger principle, saying that it is necessary that something is possible. It is necessary that something is possible. But let us start to consider the weaker principle P4. It is, in my sense, difficult to understand why P4 should be a true principle. When someone imagines that nothing exists, that is what Kant thinks to be completely correct to do. What does he lose if he admits that nothing is possible? So I see no problem to say nothing is possible, nothing exists as a thought experiment. But of course, we can now proceed to Kant's argument, which has the following conclusion. It is absolutely impossible that nothing at all exists. You see, that follows now from the principles I have just reformulated. But Kant comes to this conclusion without explicitly using P4. In the text, we do not find P4. But it is also doubtful if we can reach this conclusion without P4. But even with P4, we encounter some problems. Let me explain that in detail. So I reconstruct the argument. Premise 1 by P3 is the following. If there is no y and no p such that it is the case that y is p, there will be no x in such a way that it is possible that x is p. From this, we get premise 2, I call it P3a. If there is some y and some p in such a way that it is possible that y is p, then there is some x and some p such that it is the case that x is p. Until now, we have not gone very far. But now comes premise 3, and that is my P4. There is some y and some p in such a way that it is possible that y is p. Via modus ponens, from here we can conclude there is some x and some p such that it is the case that x is p. The argument seems to be formally correct, but it has not the conclusion Kant wants to get, namely that it is necessary that there is some x and some p such that it is the case that x is p. It may be that Kant here confused the necessitas consequentiae with the necessitas consequentis. In any case, to reach Kant's conclusion, we would need a stronger principle than P4, for instance, P4a. P4a is the following principle. There is some y and some p in such a way that it is necessarily the case that it is possible that y is p. I already mentioned that some reconstructions have in fact P4a instead of P4. However, Kant uses neither of these principles. He tries to reach his conclusion without them. Let us see this in detail. Kant starts with the following affirmation, I quote, that by which all possible things are annulated, that is absolutely impossible. One could think that this is a formulation of P4a, but I have my doubts. Kant says that the expression that by which all possible things are annulated and the expression the absolutely impossible are synonyms, in German Wechselbegriffe. But this is a mistake, of course. I read Kant's affirmation in the following way. That's my interpretation. I hope that this can work. That is my P5. If there is a state of affairs P, and P implies that there is no state of affairs that is possible, then it is absolutely impossible that P. Now, as P is a state of affairs itself, it would, if it were the case, annulate its own possibility. Therefore, affirming that P is possible leads to a contradiction. This is, in my view, the reason why P is impossible. However, the situation is quite different if we change our formula in one point. That's what I'm doing in P5a. If there is a state of affairs P, and P implies that all other states of affairs Q are impossible, then it is absolutely impossible that P. Now, we cannot conclude anymore that it is impossible that P. Which of the two readings is the good one? In Kant's view, the state of affairs that nothing exists is a state of affairs which implies that no state of affairs is possible. He concludes that this state is impossible. We should, however, distinguish between meta-states of affairs and first-order states of affairs. The state that no first-order state of affairs is the case is a meta-state of affairs. If this state is the case, according to P3, no first-order state of affairs is possibly the case. But this has no influence on the possibility of the meta-state of affairs itself. It is not impossible itself. On the contrary, if it is the case, we can infer that it is possibly the case. This implies no contradiction. So I can reach to the following conclusion of my analysis. Neither does the modern reconstruction with principles P4 and P4a lead to Kant's conclusion, nor does our interpretation of Kant's own way to establish his proof yield a satisfactory picture. Anyway, Kant's argument is a fallacy. So if the first step is a fallacy, we could, of course, get rid of all the rest and say, it's done. We need not analyze the second step anymore. But I nevertheless will do exactly this in order to have your reaction to the second step. The presumed result of the first step is, of course, not sufficient to prove the existence of God. Kant must further show that there is a being the existence of which is necessary, and that there is exactly one being that has this mode of existence. However, he gives not really an argument in favor of his position. It rather seems that he gets there by subreption. At the beginning of paragraph 2, we read, I quote Kant, all possibility presupposes some real thing in which and by which all possible content of thought is given. This is nothing new. But then Kant continues, hence, there is a certain reality, the annulation of which would annulate even the totality of inner possibility in general. So, a certain reality. Kant passes tacitly from there is some real thing to there is a certain real thing. In the first passage, the thesis is that the annulation of all things would annulate all possibility. While in the second passage, we have the stronger thesis that the annulation of one precise thing would annulate all possibility. Kant needs the stronger position to conclude with the help of P3 as further premise that, I quote, there is something that exists in an absolute necessary manner. In our terminology, we would say there is a certain state of affairs P, and it is necessary that it is the case that P. It is important to see that in the critique of pure reason, Kant criticizes this position of his second step as fallacious. He doesn't criticize his first step, though. But he has seen that the second step has some important problems. But this subreption, as I called it, opens the way for a further demonstration. In paragraph 3, Kant argues in the way of Leibniz, because the absolutely necessary being contains the real ground of all other possibility, any other thing is possible only insofar as it is given through it as its ground. This excludes, according to Kant, that another necessary being exists. For it is contradictory to exist necessarily and to depend in its existence on another being. This is not my position, this is Kant's position. I think that this is wrong. In fact, as Kant argues, if there were a second being that grounds the possibility of all other beings, the first would not be necessary anymore, because it could be substituted by the second one. However, it is a petitio principii to suppose that there is one being on which alone all possibility of other being depends. Kant's argument shows, by the way, that our second hypothesis concerning the reading of paragraph 3 of the second consideration was the right one. The necessary being is the ground of the possibility of all other beings. Its annulation would annulate their possibility, not its own. As Kant explains in paragraph 5, I quote, "This being is possible because it exists. That is, it grounds or it founds its own possibility." I now come to Kant's third task. He must show that the necessary being is in fact God as the Christian theology conceives him. We can formulate this task in our own language as follows. And for this, I formulate a sixth principle, P6. It is necessary that there is exactly one X such that X has all the perfect properties. Kant defends this thesis in the second half of his first consideration, showing that the necessary being is simple, unchangeable and eternal, and contains the highest reality. It is this second demonstration that he implicitly criticizes in his critique of pure reason. While, as I already emphasized, he considers his first step still as valid. I will concentrate now on the decisive third step of this third argument. In paragraph 6 of the third consideration, Kant argues that the necessary being is the ground or the foundation of all positive properties, that is the ens realissimum. He criticizes, however, the traditional concept of the ens realissimum, as I already mentioned at the beginning. He argues, and I think rightly so, that it is impossible because there are positive properties that exclude each other. Kant gives as example being extended and impenetrable on one side and having understanding and the capacity of intending on the other. Therefore, Kant distinguishes two ways of being the foundation of a positive property. The necessary being is the real ground of all positive properties, either by instantiating them itself or by creating other beings that instantiate them. This means that God is necessarily a creator. Deus id est creator. If one asks why it couldn't be the case that a plurality of beings are the foundation of all real possibility, The answer is that, as Kant has shown in his first step, in his second step, there is only one necessary being. This must therefore be the only foundation of all positive properties and thus of all possibilities. Let me add a short remark on the fifth paragraph of the third consideration. In this paragraph, Kant tries to show that the necessary being is unchangeable and eternal. It is easy to see that the latter must hold. A necessary being always exists. It cannot come to be or pass away. But the second property is problematic. Kant argues that the necessary being is the ground of its own possibility, that is, of the possibility of its own properties. It is possible because it exists. Therefore, Kant argues, these properties cannot be taken away from God or given to him. We may, however, ask if this is true of the property of being a creator. There is a moment in history when the creation of the world was not yet accomplished, and another later moment when it was. At the first moment, God was only a potential creator, not an actual one. This means that he underwent a change concerning his status of being the creator of the world. I have now in my paper some final critical remarks concerning the principles Kant is using in his arguments. But when presenting these arguments, I already criticized these principles, so I think I can skip these two last pages and give you more time to ask questions and to criticize my analysis. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Gerhard. So now the discussion is open. If you want to raise your hand, or I see that there was a hand. I'll make a question on the chat. Yeah, please, Evan, you can go ahead and ask your question. Evan?
Hello, Ian.
Yeah, I very much enjoyed this talk. It raises a lot of somewhat difficult questions. And I mean, so among them is the Aristotelian claim that a property can't exist without being instantiated.
Right.
Which, first of all, raises some significant questions about how you count properties, how you individuate them.
Yeah.
And it has some interesting entailments, I think, which I sort of wonder about. So, I mean, it seems to me, well, first there's the question, and this is a complicated question, whether I can think of something that doesn't exist. And I mean, there's a fairly strong intuition that I can. There are arguments against it, to be sure. But that it seems to me is problematic. You might say, well, anything you can think of that doesn't exist has as its properties that are instantiated somewhere. Right.
Yeah. The Golden Mountain.
Sorry,
The Golden Mountain, for instance.
hang on a minute. I've got a problem here.
Ah, you did not hear me.
Not cooperating. Um, yeah, I'm sorry. What?
Well, as an example, I formulate the Golden Mountain would be something that has instantiated properties but doesn't exist.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the response could be, well, but there are things that instantiate the property of being golden, and there are things that instantiate
Exactly,
being a
yeah.
mountain. So
That's
those,
my point. Yeah, that's my
yeah.
point.
Um, but you know, look, Newton devised a fairly complex theory about causation mechanism in the
Mm,
world. Um, it wasn't the correct one. And so the principle seems to preclude the possibility that Newton's system was one that imagined possibilities that must exist somewhere rather than not. That strikes me as going out on a limb, so to
yeah,
speak.
yeah,
I mean, there are a lot of cases where we don't know. We ask ourselves the question, does anything like this exist?
yeah,
And it might be that the property that is being considered dark matter, let's say,
yeah, yeah.
is something that may exist and may not. And we don't know, but we can intelligibly ask the question. If it does exist, it probably always existed. If it doesn't exist, it'll probably never exist.
Well, another example would be a speed higher than the speed of light. We can perfectly conceive of such a speed, but physics today, at least, still say such a speed doesn't exist in the
Well,
universe.
it's never been, it's actually theoretically allowable, but it's never been experimentally
Yeah, yeah,
confirmed.
yeah, yeah,
Um, so associated with this is, of course, the metaphysics of possibility. Now, that's not something, you know, in this context we could really discuss, but that's not an easy problem, and one wonders how much Kant thought about that.
yeah. Well, and the whole argument depends on it, because if we
Yes.
deny it, the first move already is stopped. So you are perfectly right. This is so essential for the proof. And you see, it's interesting to see that in the critique, he replaces this proof by another proof for, of the existence of something necessary. And this second proof is also, one can suppose that he introduced the second version because the first, he was skeptical about the first. Let me just explain how the second goes. The second says that if there is something contingent, and of course, empirically, we know that there are state of affairs that are contingent, that are, and contingents that mean that if they exist, they could also not exist, or if they are the case, they could also be not the case. This is perfectly fine, but Kant goes now a step further, which the step I do not follow him in this step. He says if there is something contingent, there, because it could be that it doesn't exist, there must be a reason or a cause why it exists. So he goes a step further and says all contingent things have causes of their existence. And then you can ask, what about these causes? Are they contingent or are they not
Yes.
contingent?
Right.
If they are contingent, they need another cause of their existence. So you get in an infinite regression, unless you suppose that the regression ends somewhere with a being or with a state of affairs, in my terminology. That is necessarily the case. But here again, Kant thinks that being unconditioned and being necessary imply each other. And I do not follow him. I think there could be a necessary being that is conditioned. You see?
Well, I mean, that follows from the regress that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Graham Oppie, by
Yeah.
the way, has a
Exactly.
similar.
So you see, this new version of the argument has many, many weak elements. And Kant himself goes on criticizing this argument in the critique. So he doesn't, as he does in the only possible argument, say that the argument is all right. Now he goes on and says, oh, this thing with the causes applies only to the empirical world. If we go beyond the empirical world, we may have something that is necessarily the case, and so on. So we have a more differentiated and more critical Kant in his critique. But still the same critique of the ontological argument, which is, of course, his great success. He's proud of it.
By the way, I mean, and with this, I'll let someone else speak. There's a very nice discussion of the ontological argument by William Rowe. Do you know this? In the introduction to philosophy,
Yeah.
which allows that existence can be a predicate, but it's one that has a logically distinct behavior. So it isn't any old predicate.
Well, I think that this is only a terminological thing, because he introduced a different concept of predicates. So, but we should look in detail in his.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's interesting. The discussion is going on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see now if there are some other questions. Yes, Gianluigi, please.
Yes, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I was wondering whether the argument in Kant functions if we accept, if we take as significance for possible, not possible in sense not impossible, but possible as contingent in Aristotle. That is, that which is usually taken as endecomenon 2, endecomenon 2, that is not impossible and not necessary.
Yeah.
Would Kant have some difficulties in this case, in this argumentation, which is when he says that it is contradictory to say that something is possible and at the same time that nothing exists? Because if I take possible as not impossible, I can follow Kant. I think Kant is right. But if I take possible as not impossible and not necessary, does function this point of Kant, the assumption that is contradictory to say nothing exists but something is possible? I have some doubts there. That is, I think I can follow Kant if I take possible in the exception and the common on one. But if I take and the common on two in the syllogistic, is Kant right then? There is really a contradiction in the adversary.
I see your point.
I am asking because perhaps I am completely wrong, but I don't
No,
know.
no, Gianluigi, it's
Yes.
completely correct. But you see, from the unilateral concept of possible to the concept of contingent, we get very easily. You see, if something doesn't exist, it possibly doesn't exist, no? And if we say that this very same thing possibly exists, we have the concept of contingency, because we get then something which is possibly existing and possibly not existing.
Yes.
So I think we can reconstruct the argument also using the concept of contingency. It's my conviction. But it's a very good point, because this confusion of unilateral possibility and contingency in the long history of philosophy has done much damage to our argumentation. We should distinguish them very carefully, and I agree with you on this point.
Okay, very good. Now, Hasha, please go ahead with your question.
Hello, Asha.
Yes, thank you so much.
How are you?
Hello. I'm
Nice to
fine,
see
thank you.
you.
How are you? Yeah, nice to see you too. Yeah, Gerhard, it's wonderful to listen to you. I really enjoyed. But in fact, long back, I was working with ontological argument during my student days, and it really brought me back to those arguments. And I'm so happy to listen to all these things. But I mean, maybe you are right, but I have some confusion, so I would like to get some clarifications from you. One thing is about I mean the way you interpret state of affairs, you know. Because I find it's little confusing, you know, because being has properties, no doubt. And I mean, like any being, whatsoever it is, whether it's a God or anything else. I mean, even a book has as a being, existence of objects also have some property. Now, do we really identify being like God with the state of affairs? That's the question, because it seems like, you know, we sort of put the cart before the horse, you know, because because, you know, I'm like, we're talking about the reality or being of God, the existence of God. That's exactly the matter of argument, whether God exists or not. That's exactly the issue. Now, whether the existence is a predicate or not. Now, if existence is a predicate, for example, the book exists right in front of me. Now, if this book exists, now this is a predicate in this case. But when we talk about God, then it becomes a problematic thing. So I was a little confused, you know, I mean, whether your use of state of affairs is the catch, which actually is leading us to all those arguments which you have very beautifully developed. So that's one point. The second point is regarding this, the possibility of P, you know, and I mean, which actually just now somebody pointed out, and I agree to a certain extent that possible is whether possible means contingent, and like exists and does not exist. Both are contingent, sure, as you said. But then the possibility of P or impossibility of P. If something is not possible, then it is impossible. I think that's also somewhere there's some kind of problematic, because when I say if P is impossible, and we symbolize by using modal notions like not possible P, and that is logically equivalent to not P is not necessarily true. So, which is like not necessary, not P. Now, in this case, if it's not possible P, then you will have double not necessary, not P. Now, does that make any difference in your symbolization? That's the question I'm trying to look at. Thank you.
Yeah, very good question, Asha. Let me start with the first. Normally, when we can identify a thing by its place in space and time, we point with the finger to a thing and say, this thing is red, or this thing is heavy, and so on. So we can identify a substance and then attribute predicates to it. But in the case of God, we cannot point with the finger to him. So in order to identify this being, we need a definite description. And that is what the philosophers did with the ens realissimum. They described him as the ens realissimum. And that was a way to identify him. And now, therefore, I argued the question whether God exists or where a certain state of affairs is the case comes to the same, because we cannot distinguish the predicates of God which are used to identify him from the predicates which are used to characterize or to determine him. But I saw myself the problem. That's why I made this little remark saying that speaking about a necessary being and speaking about a state of affairs that is necessarily the case are, at first sight, two different things. And one could, as you argued, say it is not allowed to switch over from one to the other. But my point is that in the case of God, we cannot do otherwise, because we have no other tool to identify him than by predicates, by saying he is the being who has these and these and these properties. Because the theology needs to be able to speak about God. And if we have no concept of God, that is a concept which includes no contradiction, then we cannot speak about him. And that is the whole starting point. But your second question was about the kind of possibility Kant is using, the kind of concept of possibility. And of course, he used simply, we have to look in the Critique of Pure Reason to the chapter about modalities, and he uses two different concepts of possibility. One is the traditional one, and the other is one that he introduces with his critical philosophy. So I would have to go into all these details in order to explain that. But I agree with you. We need to know what kind of concept is used when we speak of the possibility of a state of affairs or the possibility of the existence of a thing.
Great. Great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, so we still have time for one more question. Oui, yes, please, Alexei, can go ahead.
Yes, thank you for your very interesting presentation. I would like to ask you to comment on some speculations of mine. To my knowledge, about all ontological arguments, they represent or formulated in rather dialectical mode rather than in didactic or descriptive mode. In other words, their premises are important. They are not regarded as something self-evident. And if so, then what my first thought is, shouldn't we weigh their premises to compare with to the conclusion that God exists? What about the premises? The premises can be more controversial or maybe more important than the conclusion. And the second, my thought is that looking at your paper, your reconstruction, I'm not, it's not my concern about how adequately you reconstructed Kant's argument, but about your logic. So you propose to formal framework. So you have, what kind of logic do you have? I'm looking at your paper right now. What kind of logic is it? First order logic, or is it like or second order logic with modality? And what about the rules of inference? Because you have to use formal rules of inference.
Yeah.
How would you comment on this?
Well, I emphasize that I did not, in order to do this analysis of Kant, introduce logic. I should have done it in your, if I understand you right, in order to do the job. But what I did is simply, this formalism I use is simply to make the analysis easier. So I do not pretend to have such a logic at my disposal, but I still believe that.
But it's important, isn't it? It's important to focus on logic.
Yeah, sure, I agree with you. But for the analysis, it is sufficient what I did. I think it is completely transparent what my arguments are. They could still be wrong, of course.
No. I'm not asking whether your reconstruction is adequate. I'm just interested in logic. I think logic itself can be interesting, can be interesting, and as well as the premises.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I could not in this paper introduce a combination of predicate, propositional, and modal logic, what I would need to do. Because it is a very complicated stuff to introduce such a logic, show that it is complete, show that it is not, there is no contradiction in it. You see, one of my assistants introduced a new propositional logic, only propositional one. It was extremely complicated to show that it is complete and that it is not contradictory. And so I could not in such a paper try to do such a
what kind of propositional logic? New connective, just how does it differ from regular logic?
No, this one is the one of my assistant, and it's complicated he has a new concept of implication, you see.
Okay.
A different
New
concept of
implication,
implication.
new implication,
Yeah.
conditional.
But-
Something else, like.
But let me come to your first point, which I think is very important.
Mhm.
I myself insisted that the principle Kant is using, and this, and he doesn't give an argument to defend this principle, that these principles are questionable.
Mhm.
You see, why should the Aristotelian conception of real predicates be accepted? We could be a Platonist, and then the whole thing doesn't start. The whole thing doesn't start if you are Platonist.
Yeah.
So you see, that was my point. Why I criticized the Kant's starting points.
That's a
But
good
of
point.
course, he was in a context where he believed that this would be accepted by everybody, which is not the case. Still, at his time, there were Platonists and would argue differently. So he was a little bit naive about this, to believe that everybody accepts these principles. Also, what I insisted on, the question of whether if something contingent exists, that it has to have a cause for its existence. This is also a metaphysical postulate. Why is it? You cannot prove it, you see. So the whole thing could be further analyzed and question marks everywhere. But the other thing is, if we admit this principle, is the argument formally right? And you are right in order to examine this, we need a logic. But here I used only the usual propositional logics which we teach in first term classes. There's nothing special in my analysis concerning this.
Thank you.